The Engine of Evolution, Chapter 5. Evolution is a change in allele frequency within a population over time. However, evolution does not exactly tell us how life began on Earth, but it does give us an idea on how life diversified into many different forms we see today. Evolution also helps us understand how animals today continue to adapt and change in order to thrive in an environment. Here is a great example of an adaptive behavior. The Asian giant hornets are the main predators of these Japanese honeybees. According to the video source, it took 30 hornets to kill 30,000 honeybees so they could get to the bee larvae. But because of evolution, these honeybees learned to respond to the attacks of the hornets by adapting a defense mechanism. Once a hornet is inside the hive, the honeybees form together in a tight giant ball, where they raise their temperature to about 47 degrees Celsius, in which hornets cannot survive in. And just in 20 minutes, the hornet is roasted to death. This adaptive evolution is driven by natural selection. It is a process of how genes that produce better adaptations to become more frequent over time. There are 3 requirements of evolution by natural selection. The first is variability. This means that the individuals within a population must have phenotypic variations in their traits. Second is that these traits must be heritable traits that can be passed on to the next generation. Third is that the genetic variation must increase the chances of an individual's survivability and the ability to reproduce and pass on their traits to their offspring. In short, natural selection favors and selects advantageous traits that are thus sustained through the next generation. For a better understanding of natural selection, let's look at these different color-coded mice. As we can see, there are light mice and dark mice. There are phenotypic variation of traits within this mice population that create the color differences. Unfortunately for the light mice, they are visible in an area where rocks are very dark and chances are they will be eaten by predatory birds. Whereas the dark mice are more likely to survive and reach reproductive age and leave offspring. Since dark mice have higher rates of surviving and reproducing, they will pass on their genes for dark coloration onto their offspring. As a result, dark mice will be more common in the next generation than in the previous generation. Unfortunately, natural selection is generally misunderstood. Many people think that evolution happens by chance or accident and that the process is random. Yes, individuals do not try to adapt to their environment, but it is inevitable if they have the right kind of genetic variation. These variations come from mutations, which are accidental changes in the sequence of the DNA. It occurs regardless of whether they are harmful, useful, or neutral to an individual. However, it is only mutation that is random, and it is selection that is lawful because it filters the variation by eliminating the bad traits and favoring the good traits. As Richard Dawkins have stated, natural selection is the non-random survival of random variants. Evolution is not a random process. The genetic variation on which natural selection acts may occur randomly, but natural selection itself is not random at all.
So natural selection isn't the only process of evolutionary change. Another mechanism is genetic drift. It is defined as a random change in allele frequencies in a population over time. A common phrase that describes this phenomenon is called the random walk. Allele frequencies fluctuate at random as an allele gets passed on from parent to offspring until it is fixed, meaning that the allele rising to 100% frequency, or lost, meaning that the allele is completely eliminated in a population. Just like the animation above, a random allele, in this case the colored balls, is picked at random in every generation. As you can see, the blue balls are eventually fixed and the red balls are lost on the 5th generation of the population. Genetic drift and natural selection are quite the opposite of each other. Genetic drift is a purely random process. An allele gets picked at random to be passed on. However, natural selection is non-random. An allele gets passed on because it is more likely to survive. Genetic drift doesn't produce adaptations, it causes evolution of features that are neither harmful nor useful, while natural selection gets rid of harmful alleles and increases the beneficial ones. Genetic drift can actually overpower natural selection, especially in small populations, because there's a higher chance of raising harmful genes even if selection is working against it. Natural selection in action is a wonderful thing to witness in your lifetime. One great evidence that is parallel to natural selection is artificial selection. Artificial selection shows huge changes in a short period of time. For example, the breeding of domestic dogs, where we have numerous diversity today, have been selected in less than 10,000 years ago, and that is only 1% of the time it took for the wild dog species to diversify from their common ancestor in nature. Looking at the domestication of the ancestral Eurasian gray wolf to this tiny Chihuahua, humans were able to selectively breed to their liking. The only difference between natural and artificial selection is that artificial selection, it is the breeder, not the natural environment, who sorts out the variants. You can actually see evolution in real time. How? By experimenting with microbes, since they have huge population sizes and short generation times. Evolution in a test tube is exposing a microbe population, for example bacteria, to new environmental challenges and observing its ability to survive and the characteristics of its offspring. This process is more natural than artificial selection because humans don't choose which individuals to reproduce. An example that shows how microbes evolved in a short period of time is an experiment conducted by Bayer Hall and his colleagues. They deleted a gene from E. coli that produces an enzyme that breaks down lactose into food. The E. coli was then exposed to an environment with only lactose. Initially, they couldn't grow, but in a short period of time, another enzyme was able to take over and weakly broke down lactose. Then another adaptive mutation occurred where it increased the number of enzymes to acquire more food. Lastly, a third mutation in a different gene allowed E. coli to take up lactose more easily. This proves that evolution enabled bacteria to grow on a previously unusable food in a short amount of time. When antibiotics were first introduced, people thought these were the answer to cure diseases. However, they forgot that there is natural selection. Microbes have huge population sizes and short generation times in which the chances of a mutation producing antibiotic resistance is high. For example, the penicillin is a drug that kills Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. But 70 years later, 95% of the staph strains are resistant. This is because mutations occurred that gave them the ability to resist the drug. Therefore, these resistant bacteria were able to pass on their resistant gene to their offspring.
So far, we've seen examples of human-induced stress to drive evolution. It is important to note that individuals' responses to these stress or manipulation are natural. However, just as evolved organisms are observed after human intervention, nature through natural selection also drives evolution in the wild, though this is hard to observe due to the following reasons. Rate of evolution is extremely slow. Hence, it is improbable to observe a certain species of plant, for example, transform into another in a lab setting, let alone in a human lifetime. Such would be an example of macroevolution. It is more realistic, however, to observe microevolution or small changes in a trait of a species. Even then, it may take years before microevolution caused by natural selection can be observed. Number two, most organisms are already well adapted to their environment thanks to natural selection over the years. This is stabilizing selection. However, despite being well adapted, selection is still in play and will act on members of a certain population that do not have the optimal features. Here is an example of real-time selection that have been observed. Strong selection caused by drought acted upon these finches. In the period of drought of 1977, only plants with hard seeds flourished, and hence finches with big beaks were able to obtain food better and thus survived than those of which who had smaller beaks. And by having short generation time, biologists were able to observe microevolution in these species within just a few years. Evolution is harder to observe in higher organisms such as humans because of their significantly longer generation times. Countless researchers have supported that natural selection in the wild has existed and observable. However, this leads us to an even deeper dilemma. Can selection build complexity? For an evolutionary biologist who understands the intricacy and power of evolution over a long period of time, the answer is yes. But for some people, such as the creationists, they have an alternative explanation for the complex traits in higher organisms. Creationists are advocates of intelligent design. Creationists argue that complex features like flagellum of a bacteria can only be explained through the idea of God of the gaps. This essentially means that if a trait cannot be explained through science, they must have been created by a supernatural force and hence an evidence of creationism. They believe that a supernatural being helped organisms create a miracle mutation to develop complex features that they could not produce on their own. Their arguments, however, are mostly unscientific and are only founded from ignorance of the complex traits or their inexplicable origins. But there is overwhelming evidences ranging from fossil records to genetic sequencing to support complexity resulting from evolution by selection. For example, the complexity of the human eye can be scientifically explained through experiments performed by biologists. For example, an experiment by Nelson and Pelger created a mathematical model in which they were able to stimulate the evolution of a light-sensitive cell that resembles a simple eye spot of a flatworm to a complex eye. Therefore, the eye can be explained through a step-by-step process due to evolution in which improvements to the ancestral eye was compounded. Having complex eyes made it easier for our ancestors to find food, avoid predators, and move around to survive their environment. In conclusion, as Coyne stated, we can assume that natural selection is the cause of all adaptive evolution, though not every feature of evolution, since genetic drift can also play a role. It is important to understand that evolution of traits didn't arise from scratch. It came from pre-existing features. Evolution is mindless and does not aim to create a perfect organism.